Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to another video interview here. I'm Kelly from Kelly's Astrology, and today I'm joined by Michael Morris, a multi-talented healer and practitioner. Michael is someone who came across my radar 3 years ago, I think. And now Michael's brilliance with astrology, although Michael has many, many talents that you're going to hear expressions of those as we go today. Currently, Michael is working with me, helping out as a TA in many of my online training programs. So we're spending more and more time together throughout each month, through the year. And I find I always get so much out of my conversations with them. And Michael and I had a bit of a gem of a conversation a couple of months ago that led to this conversation that we want to share with you. But before I dive in with that, I want to let them tell you a little bit about themselves. So Michael, welcome. How would you like people to get to know you a little bit here?
Well, my name is Michael J. Morris, and my pronouns are they, them, their. And I am a consulting astrologer, a tarot reader, an artist, a writer, an educator, a facilitator, and the founder of my practice, which is called Co-Witchcraft Offerings. And most of my work right now is focused on doing astrology consultation work, doing readings with people, doing teaching with your courses, doing TA work with you, doing some writing projects, things like that. I'm also teaching some queer yoga classes here in Columbus, Ohio, where I live, if people are interested in that sort of thing. And then working on various offerings throughout the year. I sometimes, when we're not in a global pandemic, I facilitate more in-person rituals and movement practices. I have a background in dance and performance. My PhD is in dance studies. And so a lot of my work has been actually looking at the intersections or the overlaps between practices like dance and movement practices and yoga and ritual and magic and witchcraft and healing, and how can we work at the kind of intersections or the overlaps between these different practices. And so that's work that I really love doing, hope to do more as we find our way through this global pandemic. But right now it's really focused on the astrology work and teaching and consulting and doing that sort of thing in the world.
That's beautiful. And I know that you also do some year ahead timing offerings, and you've just recently put out a guide to 2022, which is a downloadable offering people can grab from your website.
Yes, indeed. I just released that less than a week ago. So it's an astrology guide for 2022. It's a couple hours long. It's a recording, and it's basically just looking at what I think of as the major astrology stories by transit for the year of 2022. Going through and describing and discussing what I think each of these might mean for us, and then also bringing in the voices, quotations, and ideas from prominent feminist thinkers to really shape or offer some inspiration for how we might think about, but also how we might work with some of these transits. So if that's the kind of support that people are looking for, it's downloadable on my website. And I also think of it as like one of the offerings I can give to folks or make available for folks, because my consulting practice tends to stay pretty booked up. And so right now, as of the time that we're recording this, I'm still booking for January, February, and March of 2022. But I know that when I get to that point where I'm fully booked up, it's nice to have something to offer folks so that people can work with and live with the wisdom of astrology in other ways if I don't have one-on-one consultations available. So that's downloadable. And if whenever this comes out, if people are interested in maybe looking for a reading with me or doing astrology together in a one-on-one way, just going to the bookings page on my website, and I will have clearly displayed whether or not I still have sessions available at that time.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it's such a beautiful way to share our love of astrology with more and more people, and to have something available when the client consults are booked for that period in time. And you used a phrase when you were describing your year ahead offering about the stories that the transits are kind of telling for 2022. And even just that concept of the telling the stories sort of took me straight to the topic that we have set as our intention today, which is sort of passing out the differences between the story that the sun in the birth chart is telling or sharing about the individual or more, and how that is different to the story that we get from the ascendant and the ascendant ruling planet in the chart. And this sort of distinction is something that becomes really important in ancient or Hellenistic styles of astrology. And working with students that come from a modern background, this is one of those pieces that always takes a beat for people to kind of shift their thinking around. And I've loved the way that you've described your understanding of this. And I know you're very respectful of the teachers and the ancient authors that have informed your understanding of this. But I'd love for you to share some of your thoughts about how you see the sun as this central principle in the chart, but still distinct and different from the ascendant and the ascendant ruling planet.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and my background, my training in astrology is primarily in the Hellenistic tradition, studying with folks like Demetra George and Chris Brennan, doing online courses with Chani Nicholas, and then, of course, online courses with you. And you also bring in a lot of the traditional astrology in your work as well. And so with that being my primary grounding in my own astrological practice, but then working with folks who are coming from a more modern perspective, and even people who aren't necessarily coming from a modern astrological perspective, but just clients coming from with very limited knowledge of astrology, and that focuses mostly on the sun sign, and really focusing on the sun sign as like, this is who I am in some way. And I think in the modern astrology, there can sometimes be an association of the sun with things like the ego or the identity or your like the true core or essence of who you are in some sense. And that's different than how I have experienced or encountered the sun in the ancient tradition, in which the sun is more often associated with things like the king or rulership or prominence or visibility, the kind of notoriety or reputation. And yet there is an indication of the person and the sense of self and the identity in the chart, and that's the ascendant and the ruler of the ascendant in the ancient astrology. I often talking about the ascendant as the most personal point in the chart. Everything else in the sky, including the sun, basically stays more or less where it is when you're born, but the ascendant changes signs every couple of hours. It changes degrees every few minutes. So more than anything else in the chart, it's really specific to the person. I often think of it as the place where the sky meets the earth as your body comes into the world. And that's from that point, that starting point, this meeting place between earth and sky, which is literally the basis of astrology. That starting point that is so particular to you is what orients you to your whole life, but also to the whole chart. And what I mean by that is the house system, where everything else is in the chart, is set by the ascendant. And so it's this very personal point in the chart that describes your origin, and then how you are oriented to, how you're motivated toward the life that you're living, the life that you're making and creating and inhabiting. And then the ruler of the ascendant, by which I mean the planet that rules the sign on the ascendant. Each of the zodiacal signs have a planet that is said to rule it. And in especially ancient astrology, we work with the visible planets as the rulers of the signs. And so depending on what sign is on your ascendant, there's a planet that is the ruler of that sign. And it's in some sense a kind of like avatar or concentration of where you are in the chart, of where we can look for topics related to your sense of self, your self-actualization, the things that might matter a lot to you, as well as things like your health, your vitality, your body, the things that relate to your incarnate existence. But those are really going to be described in ancient astrology by the ascendant and the ruler of the ascendant, which then means we have to loop back and say, so then what is the sun in the chart, or what is really anything else in the chart? If the ascendant and the ruler of the ascendant is descriptive of the native or the person themselves, then what's everything else in the chart? And that's really where, as we were talking about having this conversation, where it started to open up and expand, is that there is this distinction between the sun and the ascendant ruler, but there's a larger sort of philosophical divergence that we can map here between modern treatments of astrology, which are like, there's not just one of those. And I want to be careful to not like collapse all of 20th and 21st century astrology into like modern astrology as if it's all the same thing. There's actually many different traditions of modern astrology, some that focus more on psychological factors, some that focus more on evolutionary qualities of the kind of emergence of a person across lifetimes or throughout a single lifetime, things like that. But a kind of common denominator throughout many of these modern traditions is a sense that the whole chart and each of the planets in the chart describe a different aspect or part of the native or the person, that all of this is almost like a map or a representation of your psyche or different parts of your personality, different needs or drives or desires, and that we're really doing something almost like character analysis through astrology and using that in a really valuable way to help you navigate your life, your choices, find your values, get in alignment with your desires and move well with those things, ultimately in a way that I think can be profoundly healing. But that's also very different from a view of, in the ancient tradition, my understanding of which is that everything else in the chart, other than the ascendant and the ascendant ruler, sometimes what we call the luminary of sect, which will be either the sun in a day chart or the moon in a night chart, but mostly all of the other planets in the chart are describing other qualities, situations, the kind of material conditions of your life, as well as quite literally other people. And that's true of what we sometimes call the natural significations of the planets or their general significations. Things like we associate the moon with the mother or the sun with the father, or sometimes Mercury gets associated with younger siblings, or Mars with brothers and Venus with sisters and so on. So the kind of natural significations of the planets, as well as what the topics for which they are responsible by rulership. So what houses in the chart are they ruling, such that the ruler of the fourth house speaks to or describes the parents. The ruler of the fifth house can describe sexual partners or sexual experiences, as well as your relationship with children in your life or children that you may have. The seventh house and the ruler of the seventh house speaks to your partners, the people who you are in committed relationships with. The sixth house can describe employees or subordinated people, marginalized people, people who are not always empowered by existing systems within our world, within our social life, and so on and so on. That each of 11th house, third house can speak to friends, third house can speak to siblings, and each of the planets that rule these places then take on some of the responsibility for describing these other people in our lives. And that's quite different than each of the parts of the chart describing you.
It's so different because my original training in astrology was, I would say, modern psychological, where the planet was a part of you. And having a background in counseling and psychotherapy, I was like, well, this is just a different type of psychotherapy, like internal family systems or something, different internal parts. Whereas the ancient model of astrology is more that your Venus might have nothing to do with you or even your love life, but it might represent circumstances pertaining to career if you have a Taurus 10th house or a Taurus midheaven, for instance. And there is a clarity and a simplicity to that ancient way of, in some ways, externalizing, not the whole of the planet, because I know that's something we also want to talk about, that planets do multiple things, but that there is one layer of meaning of each planet that can describe a different type of person or a different set of topics in your life, rather than a psychological dynamic inside you, rather than only being about the psychological dynamic, I guess.
And I think that's really important language, what you just said there, that rather than only being about that, and even some of the earlier language you used in terms of, like, let's say the ruler of the 10th house or the midheaven, describing the circumstances related to these topics, such that if we assess the condition of the planet ruling the midheaven and it's in really great condition by sign, or if it's in an angular house, or if it's in positive aspects to the benefics, or really any aspect to the benefics, if it's being witnessed by the benefics, Venus and Jupiter, all of that can speak to I mean, we can perhaps get some information about the kind of career you might have in terms of what it is you might be doing. But overall, especially in the ancient astrology, that speaks to how well supported you may be in the conditions surrounding your career or your public roles or your reputation or your legacy, the things you're trying to develop and leave behind. And of course, that's related to you, but it's not quite the same thing as saying this is part of you. So part of that, as you were talking about the layers of meaning, one layer is these circumstances and conditions related to your life, circumstances, events, the kind of concrete material world that you inhabit and how you relate to it in some way. And I think that's part of maybe where this conversation is kind of orbiting, is that we as 21st century astrologers have to navigate or grapple with these very different ways of making meaning of not only the sun and the ascendant ruler and the ascendant, but really the whole chart. There's a pretty dynamic difference between what it is we are looking at, or the kinds of meaning we're looking for in relationship to the chart as a whole. And I think bridging that, or finding our ways to what's the connection between these different points of view, that's really, I think, the work that we get to do as 21st century astrologers. And of course, you can be committed to one of these perspectives or the other, or yet another. Probably there are even other perspectives.
There are more than these two, for sure.
Absolutely, there are.
Yes.
But just that someone could be a fully committed traditional astrologer and be working fully within that paradigm or that philosophical orientation, or fully committed to the modern psychological view of the chart. Like I'm not making any sort of like, we all need to be doing this work.
Not at all.
But it's actually an opportunity that being astrologers in this really exciting time in the 21st century, we have the opportunity, we get to find what are the connections between these really different points of view on what it is we're trying to do in astrology and what the chart itself is actually capable of describing to us. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense. And some of what you're describing reflects in many ways my own journey with astrology, studying astrology in Australia in the late 90s, where there was a lot of modern psychological material, and some of the ancient translation works were starting to happen, but sort of in the US. And the world in the 90s wasn't what it is now, where if something happened in America, it was global within 24 hours. You know, if it was going on in America and we had to wait for books to get published or cassette tapes to get shipped around the world, you know, it was some time before things were disseminated as quickly as they are now. And so my own trajectory with astrology has, I felt that it has really opened up as I've been able to encounter other points of view, and that there is a richness and a textured to nature to astrology that, as I've been able to pull in different pieces, and, you know, this is the medieval approach or this is the ancient approach, it's so much more rich. And in my experience, it's more helpful in client practice because there are extra pieces that I can pull on rather than sort of just that slice. And I think this is where, you know, the phrase that keeps going through my head is a phrase that I've heard you say to students in the discussion and the TA space so often, which is about the sun as this central organizing principle. Because one of the things that students can struggle with when it's like, well, if the sun isn't me, if it's not my identity, if it's not the essence of who I am, then what do I do with it? And in what ways is it even important? And what I love about these questions, because I've gone through them in my own practice, is it pushes me and it pushes all of us to get closer to the essence of the thing. So if we get closer to the essence of the sun, but it's not my identity or my ego, but it's still important, you know, how do we understand that, I guess? And I know you have mentioned a few symbolic pieces and philosophical pieces about the sun as this central organizing principle. I wonder if you want to elaborate or share those briefly, if you can remember them.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, I talk about these in sessions all the time. I mean, exactly. In the modern psychological view, the sun is often discussed in terms of the ego or the identity, which we might think of as sort of the center of who we are, or the core of who we are, the essence of our sense of self in some sense. In ancient astrology, again, there's more of these associations with authority and rulership and kingship and things like that, which has a kind of like pinnacle quality to it. But I also like thinking with some of the astronomical and some of the traditional schemas with which in which we find the sun. So one is, if we just think about the sun in the solar system, that it's the celestial body around which everything else in the solar system orbits. And so there's a centrality to the sun in our solar system. But then also from a geocentric perspective, the perspective that astrology is often practiced, taking the Earth as the vantage point from which we're viewing the solar system, there's a schema or a sequence of understanding the planets that comes from the ancient tradition called the Chaldean order or the Chaldean order, that's putting the planets in sequence according to their planetary speed based on our perception from Earth. And so the Chaldean order would be the moon as the fastest moving body, then Mercury, then Venus, then the sun, then Mars, then Jupiter, then Saturn, of the visible planetary bodies. And the sun is at the center of the Chaldean order as well, that from our vantage point on Earth, the sun its speed is right there in the middle of all of these other visible bodies. And so I often describe the sun in someone's chart as describing a central organizing principle of the life. It's that around which we might consider how the other parts of life are orbiting, or in some sense need to be integrated or into some sort of consistency with whatever the sun is describing. And what I mean by that is whatever house the sun is placed in might describe topics that hold some central role in your life around which everything else orbits. So just easy examples would be like, if the sun is in the 10th house, career might be one of those really important things where like you are willing to move across the country for your career, or you're willing to put your relationships, your friendships, your family life, maybe in a secondary position to the career in some sense. Or if the sun is in the 7th house, relationships might be the most important thing, such that you might turn down a job if your relationship anchors you to a place that's not where that job is, or so on. Or if the sun is in the 7th house and there's some sort of maybe friction or conflict with your family of origin, maybe they don't approve of the relationship or they're not in favor of that partnership, you might let the family ties go because the relationship holds this central organizing principle. Those are just very simple examples of what I'm talking about, but it's not simply that the sun is you, but that the sun and where it sits in the chart can describe what you organize your life around, what you are kind of committed to giving this central role of importance in your life. And of course, there's lots of other factors we would want to look at in the chart. I don't want to reduce the whole chart to like, if your sun's in the 7th house, everything else is second to your relationships. Important. Yes. That's not exactly what I'm saying, but that it's a starting point for the discussion around the sun. Yeah. And then I loved what you said in terms of your own journey in astrology and starting in the more modern psychological and then bringing in more of the traditional, and how that gives you more to work with in the consulting practice. That even while this is my starting point with the sun, as I'm in conversation with a client, we get to find out what the sun means in their chart, what it describes. Because of course, in addition to what I'm thinking of as its natural or general significations of being a central organizing principle, the sun is also going to rule a house. So whatever house is occupied by the sign of Leo, the sun is also going to describe those topics. The sun might also, in traditional astrology, describe the father figure or one of the parents. If you're raised by parents who are not male and female, or if you only have one parent, or so on, the sun can describe a relationship to the parent. And that the sun takes on all of these potential qualities. And that's actually one of the ways we might bridge these two very different perspectives of what the sun describes, or even what the chart describes, which is allowing planets, allowing houses, allowing asteroids, allowing stars, allowing things in the chart to take on a multivalent quality of signification, by which I mean it's allowed to mean more than one thing. Yeah. It can describe more than one thing. And that's actually the beauty of working with astrology in the long term, is that you continue to discover and find what that planet is describing in your life, in your chart in particular.
And that multivalency is so important. I think it's one thing that when people are coming to learn about astrology, students, particularly early in their studies, would like clear, specific, guidelines or rules almost, or terms and things. Well, this can just be that, and then other things have to be elsewhere. But the nuances and the ability to really be personalized or individualized, what the birth chart offers in terms of such a unique take on an individual or their life and their experiences, means that, each planet is doing multiple things at once. And it's part of the real magic, and I think some of the specificity in astrology, but I think it's also part of what can make it seem incredibly complex and quite tricky to get your head around in those first few years of devoting yourself to studying astrology. And so if you're in that place in your studies and your learning, just keep going, like kind of somehow find a way to be at peace with the messiness or the fact that something is this and that at the same time. Because when you can work with that multivalency and those multi-pieces, it is going to open up a chart in such a profound way. And you were sharing before we jumped on about a client example recently that helped kind of highlight that for you with a Cancer rising chart with the moon. And this is such a great example because in a Cancer rising chart, the moon is going to represent like 4 or 5 really important things that are different and will show up differently. So how, do you want to share a little bit about that example or how you worked with that?
I do. And I also, before I get there, I want to share something that came up as you were talking about this, like being in the messiness and allowing things to take on more than one meaning. I feel like that's not only instructive about the nature of astrology, it's actually instructive about the nature of being a person and what it means to live in the world. It's like that desire to want it to be this or that in a mutually exclusive, hard line, black or white.
Either or.
It turns out identity and personhood actually isn't like that. And that's, I think, true of all of us. I am convinced that it is true of all of us. And also coming from a background as a queer person, as a trans, non-binary, genderqueer person, and then working and being with so many queer and trans people in community, I think queer folks, trans folks, have to grapple with that messiness in a way that teaches us something so important about all of us, that in fact, all of us are more complex, more nuanced, and more specific than any sort of reductive, simple, easy category that we've been given by our society, by our social expectations, that we are all more than what fits in any of those boxes, which doesn't mean you're not those things. So if you are someone who was assigned female at birth and you identify as a woman, that doesn't mean you're not a woman, but it might mean that there's parts of you that are more complex or exceed whatever that category means
whatever
to
that
you.
Box
exactly.
Limit you to, or
Or even like if you're someone who identifies as heterosexual or straight, and that's your primary understanding of your sexuality, and that is true, and that's true of you. A shift that might shift the frame is, what about sexuality that we describe or understand that's not defined by the gender of our partner? That's one axis at which we can understand sexual desire. What about all your other sexual desires that have nothing to do with the gender of your partner? How much more of yourself comes into view when we start to explore what doesn't fit in these easy categories? And so this is bridging back into the astrology. I think what astrology is really well equipped to support us in discovering is all these ways in which parts of ourselves are already more than one thing. Parts of our chart are more than one thing as we relate to this, whatever you want to call it, representation, this map, this mandala that we call the chart. We get to come into more and more relationship with more possibilities of who we are and who we can be, or who we can become through the chart. And so that example that you were referencing, so this was a recent client example, Cancer rising, and so the moon ruling the ascendant, of course, going back to what we were describing earlier, is descriptive of the person. That's who they are. And it gives us some sense of what their motivations are, what they're seeking in life, what they are trying to accomplish in their beingness and in their sense of self. And also, the moon describes the mother. Mm-hmm. That's one of its ancient significations. Actually, I don't think there's an ancient author who doesn't describe
who disagrees
the moon.
with that. Yeah, that's been consistent through the entire lineage,
all the way through into modern astrology. So then, in this particular situation, in this chart, there were several hard aspects with the moon.
Yeah.
And so, as we were talking through this, part of what came up for the client was that these hard aspects with the moon were very descriptive of their relationship with their mother, that it was a tense relationship, that there were some antagonisms in their relationship with their mother. And also, as we talked through, and this was just in one session, imagine if we were able to dig into this for like multiple sessions for many years. It was also descriptive of some inner conflict, some things that they experienced themselves where they felt that pull in one direction or another, or this push towards needing to adjust in some way because there are competing desires. And that was quite instructive as well. And in that moment, it felt very important to acknowledge that the moon was descriptive in this chart of both the native, the person, the client that I was working with, and also descriptive of their mother without collapsing the two into one another, that you are your mother in some kind of simple way, because actually part of this person's experience of their mother was this tension, this antagonism. And so they actually felt quite at odds with their mother. It wouldn't have been helpful in that conversation to be like, well, don't you think actually you are your mother? Like that wasn't where that conversation needed to go, and probably not even true. And so in that moment, that's just one example of how do we let something in the chart give it this multivalence, allow it to speak to more than one thing without it becoming an equation. Because the moon describes you, and because the moon describes your mother, you then are your mother. No, it's not that simple. It's like each of the planets gets to take on these different roles, these different significations in the chart without equating them to one another, I think. I mean, that's one of the ways that I bridge this. Yeah.
Totally. And I think the reason we always have these riff conversations on this is that we both have like mind. Because as you're saying that, I'm like, oh yeah, that's like a Gemini rising chart that would have a fourth house Virgo, Virgo IC or Virgo fourth house for sure. So we've got Mercury ruling the ascendant, representing the individual, but Mercury also describing the parents, the childhood, the early upbringing. And to be able to hold space that they are not the same thing. The person is not their upbringing. They are a product of their upbringing, or they have been shaped or influenced or affected by their upbringing, but that there is some essence to the individual that stands separate from that, I guess. And that's kind of what you're getting at, is that these planets can be representing something that might describe a situation that influences us and also be us or be a different part of our life. And it's like we can sort of say it quite succinctly, because at the end of the day, it's a simple theory. But when you stop and think about it, it's a bit mind-blowing, and it takes you into this really kind of big conceptual place. And I know that, it's working with astrology with this sort of ancient framework has really helped me get into the nuances and the subtleties within a chart and within a person, and to understand them, but also what shapes them. And I know that's something that you've explored a lot, that piece about identity and personhood, and how you're seeing the different elements of that in the chart.
Absolutely. I mean, what you were describing of like, it might seem simple on the surface, but if we actually give it our attention and our energy, it's actually quite profound. There's a profound shift in our understanding of something like the ontology of personhood or subjectivity. And by ontology, I mean like the nature of, or the beingness of this. It's a philosophical term, but such that these other parts of the chart definitely can inform and shape us, but actually it might even go further than that. It might be that we are constituted by these other conditions, these other people, these relationships, such that when we start to bridge this sort of modern view of the chart and this ancient view of the chart, perhaps part of what we come to is, I think this is the beautiful potential of bridging these two perspectives, is an understanding of personhood as composed of relations from which we are never separate, from which we are never disentangleable, a relational or even a kind of like ecological understanding of what it means to be a person. And what I mean by that is this is a very different view than saying that I am an individual and I am in relationship with these other individuals who I might call my parents or my partner or my coworkers or my friends, and that we're all individuals interacting. This is not that. This view that I'm kind of like moving towards and that I try to bring into my practice when I'm consulting with folks is an understanding that who I am is because of, in a kind of like, I don't want to make it reducible to causation, but a co-constitutive. I become in part who I am through these relations with these people who raised me, who shaped so much of not only who I am, but the conditions in which I became who I am, such that who I am is never separable from these people. If they had not been in my life, I would not be who I am. And of course, that's also true of the people that we partner with, the people who we love. And actually, it may be meaningful to share this little quote that it just came up for me yesterday. The Black feminist philosopher, writer, cultural critic Bell Hooks died this week, and her death was announced yesterday. And so I was rereading a lot of her books yesterday as a kind of process of grieving. And in her book, All About Love, New Visions, she writes, "Yet when we commit to true love, we are committed to being changed, to being acted upon by the beloved in a way that enables us to be more fully self-actualized. This commitment to change is chosen. It happens in mutual agreement." And I think that's not only such a beautiful understanding of love, it speaks to the way the seventh house and the ruler of the seventh house, the people who we are in committed partnership, the people with whom we've chosen to love, we are not the same person we were before we made that choice or separate from that choice, such that it's not simply that I'm an individual who's in this relationship. I am no longer who I was because I am in this relationship. And I think that's one of the ways that this can speak to how something in the chart could describe someone who is not me, and also describe some of these psychological personality, psyche, parts of myself in the more modern sense. How it can describe both of these things is, in fact, it may lead us to this more profound understanding of what it means to be a person constituted in and through these relations, which I actually think is a quite feminist view. That actually many of the people
relational focus.
The relational, exactly. The kind of the rejection or the refusal of any sort of radical individualism. And to understand that we are always constituted in and through relations, in and through relationality. And there's lots of folks who's written on those topics. Like I think of science studies people like Donna Haraway and Karen Barad, who's a feminist quantum physicist who really thinks about relationality at the level of quantum of materiality.
Physics,
But then also Black feminist folks like Bell Hooks, who I just read from, and then Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who's written about this refusal of individualism in a lot of different places. And so just to name and to credit some of this thinking that it's not an accident that given my background, given those who have constituted who I am,
who you are,
that I am coming to this view of astrology between the modern and the ancient in this particular way to understand the chart as descriptive of these constituting relations, if that makes sense.
It does. And it's, there was a phrase that you used about how these other people and other circumstances, it was something about not just the relationship, but how they've contributed to the conditions in which you have become. So that, the people that we choose to partner with, our seventh house people, we are choosing and often we're doing this unconsciously. So it's good to like say it out loud. We're choosing to be shaped by them. We're choosing to become a certain version of ourselves or to grow in a certain way as a result of the dynamic, the relational influence. And it is almost, I mean, my take, and this is my personal opinion as well, I think it's impossible to separate that. You know, and I think about my own experiences childhood-wise. I was raised for the majority of my childhood by a step parent. You know, for the latter part of my childhood, I had, you know, a biological parent and a step parent. And that step parent is not who I am, but they have definitely informed the person that I have become in terms of my understanding of family dynamics, but also in terms of myself, you know, in ways that I like and in ways that I don't like, in many ways, you know, that a parent influences us. But to the point that there are many people in my adult life now who would know me and their step parent of mine without knowing that they're not my biological parent, and will make comments about, oh, this mannerism, or this is, you know, there's similarities between the two of you, if you like. And it's so interesting that we are becoming, or we have become, through the people that have contributed their energy and their essence to us over the years. So
Absolutely.
It's beautiful to hear your take on this, Michael.
Well, and I think what you just touched on gestures towards the dynamic, ongoing practice of astrology, that we're also not only our natal chart. We are also all of our transits and our progressions and our zodiacal releasing periods, and people who work with the Daria or work with primary directions, like all these timing techniques or annual perfections that we're teaching right now in the course. Like all of these timing techniques actually are descriptive of that becoming, the becoming that the chart perhaps describes an origin or a potentiality. This is the promise or the potential of a life. And then it's actually in the application of timing techniques that we understand the unfolding of that potential throughout our lifetime, and the ways people come into our lives to fulfill these parts of our chart that then shape or constitute who we are in some sort of key way.
Yeah, this is such a beautiful conversation, because there's some practical pieces about like the sun versus the ascendant and the ascendant ruling planet. But I love how you're bringing in so much of your philosophical and feminist background and understandings that just adds up to this really rich, in itself, multi-layered kind of understanding of what's going on in the chart and how that can be used to be of service to those that we have the privilege of sitting in session with.
Well, and that, I mean, I'm not going to say it's entirely indebted to you, but it's largely inspired by you, because there was something that you said in your one of your keynote addresses. Maybe you did more than one that year, but no, your keynote address at NORWAC 2019, when you talked about the importance of cross-pollination in astrology, and that the things we do other than astrology. So I think you talked about your gardening and your cooking, and the ways that that offers metaphors for understanding or articulating the chart, that each of us are cross-pollinating our astrology with these other practices, these other studies, these other things that we engage in. That's part of how astrology becomes meaningful to us. And I'm always quite interested in inviting or encouraging people to be very intentional about what they're choosing to cross-pollinate with, in terms of, if you want to be a participant in something like movements towards social justice, towards dismantling systems of oppression like sexism and racism and misogyny and all the other isms that we live in, not just as words or ideas, but like the actual conditions of our life. If we want to engage in that, then maybe in addition to reading your astrology books and taking your astrology classes, maybe also pick up a book by a Black feminist thinker, so that that is available for you to draw on in the way that you're cross-pollinating, such that your astrology is always thinking with these other figures. Actually, just this past weekend, I co-presented at a conference on astrology and climate change that was hosted by the Mayo School of Astrology in the UK. And that conference was such an invitation to do this exact thing, because it was in the theme of the conference to talk about astrology and climate change meant that we were looking at very specific charts and talking about significations of the moon and Saturn. I co-presented with astrologer Drew Levanti. And so we're talking through a lot of these significations, but then we were also bringing in the work of ecofeminists and philosophers and Black feminists and social justice organizers around climate justice. And that helped us understand the astrology in a way we would not have if we had not thought those things together. So what you're gesturing towards in what I'm doing and like bringing my background in feminism and queer thinking and queer theory and bringing that to the astrology, I'm pointing back to your invitation to cross-pollinate in our astrology, and then just kind of expanding that invitation further for folks to be intentional. What is it that you want to cross-pollinate in your astrology, such that, I mean, even the astrology guide that we were talking about earlier that I just released, that really how I'm talking through things like the Mars retrograde in Gemini, I went and looked at Angela Davis's chart because Angela Davis has Mars in Gemini. So it's like, what does Angela Davis have to teach us about the Mars retrograde in Gemini?
Found some really retro beautiful in Gemini in her chart?
It's not retrograde in Gemini.
Retro, okay.
It's just, it's direct in Gemini.
But it is in Gemini, yeah.
So it's like, but that was like, okay, who do I know who has Mars in Gemini? Oh, Angela Davis does. So going back through it, actually, it was quite, I sometimes think of it as like astrological bibliomancy. It's like the astrology inspires me to go looking through my books again and be like,
yes.
And then the books offer something to the astrology. Anyway, all of this is just to say that there's this invitation to be intentional in who we're choosing and how we're choosing to make meaning with the astrology in relation to these other things that we do and read and process and understand.
That's a beautiful point. And I always feel like, oh, and now we're at the end of our conversation. It feels like, oh, we just got there. So I love that. I echo that. And if people want to let us know in the comments below, what are some of the things that you like to bring in as cross-pollinating pieces? And they may be things that are happening organically without, your awareness. Like I realized it was only after a while that I realized I talked about baking a lot when I was teaching. And then I thought, okay, there's something here about food and about nourishment and about how that's like earthy and grounding and elemental in ways. But then to make it more explicit, as you're saying, Michael, to choose what you want to bring in, knowing that whatever you're bringing in is going to be cross-pollinating and informing what you're doing, whether you realize it or not. Is there anything you want to say? Like, sorry, what were you going to say then?
I was just going to say, I would love to read those comments. I would love to hear what other people are cross-pollinating with in their astrology and the choices they're making in that. Students will often say, well, I do this other thing, acupuncture or naturopathy or herbal medicine. I'm like, fantastic. They can go together. You can run them in parallel. They will inform each other regardless of whether you intend for them to come together. And to that point, maybe one last thing I do want to make sure I say is that in terms of like what are you cross-pollinating with, and maybe not even always conscious of, that even though I've been talking about this idea of the sun as a central organizing principle for a couple of years now in my work with clients, in 2021, there was a great episode of the Astrology Podcast. I think it was episode 302 with Demetra George and Chris Brennan talking about the sun and its signification. And Demetra actually says something along these lines of the sun functioning. Let's see, what does she say? She kind of talks through some of the Chaldean order and the Thema Mundi and things. But then right at the end of this passage, she says, so these are three different ways of using completely different conceptual structures that we see that the central organizing principle of the sun holds. And when I heard that, I was like, I've been talking about that for years. How lovely to hear Demetra George using similar language. But then it's also like, well, I've studied with Demetra George for years now. It's like, maybe that's something I picked up from Demetra and I don't even know that I picked that up. But yeah, exactly. And so it's like, whether it's because we're on parallel tracks of thinking or whether that's something that she said that's kind of seeped in and then I started using it in my own work. So I just wanted to name that resonance, that whether it's something that I learned from Demetra or learned alongside Demetra, that idea of the sun as a central organizing principle is one of the things that I can see cross-pollinating with someone who's been just one of the most inspiring teachers in my practice. So just wanted to name her and honor her before we wrapped up.
We should always honor Demetra
Always.
Always. We all owe so much to her. Yeah. Whether you explicitly got it from her, because this is the beauty of the teachers that we choose to study with, is that their information and their turns of phrase and their own understandings of things will go inside you, even if you don't consciously recognize it at the moment. Mm-hmm. So whether it's that you explicitly got it from an encounter with Demetra, or whether that you picked up the thread that she was picking up on because you were both reading, the ancient sources. And in many ways, it's sort of irrelevant. You've ended up in a place where you have this beautiful phrase, and Demetra also has it. And yeah, so episode 302 of the Astrology Podcast with Chris Brennan, Demetra is on there. And Demetra's latest book, Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice, Volume 1, is currently available, and we're all eagerly awaiting Volume 2. I know the editor and publisher is, working diligently, but these things, good things take time. And Michael, for people who would like more from you, your website, is it Co-Witchcraft or Michael J. Morris? I better ask you to clarify.
My website is michaeljmorris.co.
michaeljmorris.co. Your astrology guide to the skies of 2022 is available for download now. And if people would like a session, Michael is one of the people that I refer to for consults, although I know they are often equally full in their own practice, and that's okay. Again, great practitioners are worth being on the waiting list for. Mm-hmm. So all those details are on your website. So thank you so much, Michael, for joining me today. And thank you to all of our watchers and listeners. We really appreciate being able to share astrology with you. If you have any questions for Michael, please leave them in the comments below. If there's anything you'd like to hear more from either of us, the comments are a great place to let us know your thoughts or your questions, and we will do our best to honor those in the future. But for now, we'll say goodbye. Take good care, everyone. Till next time. Bye.
Thanks, Kelly.